A long time ago, there was a deadly disaster that shook the entire world. It changed how we understand our planet and made us question everything we know about God and nature itself. Welcome to my channel. And today, let's go back in time to discover what happened in Lisbon on November 1st, 1755. It was a day like any other. The year is 1755 and the place is Lisbon, capital of Portugal. Life is good in this city. Back then, Lisbon was one of the richest cities in all of Europe. It had fancy palaces, bustling markets, and impressive cathedrals. People were going about their daily lives, working, shopping, chatting with friends. Then suddenly, everything changed. November all those years ago was a religious holiday, All Saints' Day. On this day, Christians remember all the saints and martyrs of the church, so people went to church in their finest clothes. Thousands of people crowded into the churches, knelt down to pray, and lit up the interior with countless candles. For a moment, it felt like the city of God had come to life. But just moments later, the ground began to shake. People ran outside to find the source of the commotion. They saw the sea was pulled away from the shore, revealing the seabed. And that's when the earth moved again. People stood frozen in fear as they felt the full force of the quake. It seemed like it lasted forever. But in reality, the earthquake only lasted about 6 minutes. When the shaking finally stopped, people began to explore the damage. They found buildings had collapsed, homes lay in ruins, and the smell of dust filled the air. People started screaming and crying as they realized what had happened. Thousands of people had been crushed to death under fallen walls and roofs. The streets were blocked by debris and littered with dead bodies. And that was just the beginning. Soon after the earthquake, people began to notice that the river had stopped flowing. It looked like the water had vanished into thin air. They rushed to the docks to find out what was happening. And that's when the giant waves arrived. People screamed and tried to run away, but it was too late. The waves crashed over the docks and swept thousands of people into the sea. Ships were tossed around like toys and houses were ripped from their foundations. This disaster was a tsunami. It was the result of the earthquake, and it hit Lisbon with full force. The water receded once more, revealing a seabed covered with dead bodies. Then it rose again and crashed into the city. The cycle repeated several times, each wave more violent than the last. The waves even reached as far as the Caribbean, over 6,000 miles away. In total, the earthquake and tsunami wiped out 85% of Lisbon. Tens of thousands of people were dead. Whole families were buried under the rubble or washed away by the waves. Fires broke out across the city, burning for 5 whole days. The destruction was unimaginable. So what actually happened? Why did nature suddenly turn so violent? When the earthquake hit, people had no idea. They didn't know there was such thing as seismology or fault lines. They lived in an age when science was not very advanced. Today, scientists think they know what happened. They say the earthquake was caused by a massive fault line under the Atlantic Ocean. The tectonic plates suddenly slipped, releasing huge amounts of energy. This created a vertical movement of the seabed, which generated giant waves. The waves spread outwards in all directions, causing the destructive tsunami. But back then, people didn't know any of this. They searched for someone to blame. At first, many people thought it was the French. There had been tensions between Portugal and France at the time, and many Portuguese people blamed the French for the disaster. Others blamed the British. Still others blamed the Spanish. But no one could prove anything. The truth was, nobody had ever heard of an earthquake causing a tsunami before. Within weeks, people began to look for a more convincing explanation. And that's when some started to blame God. Religion was a big part of life in the 18th century. Most people were very religious and believed in divine punishment. Some said the disaster was God's way of punishing sinners. Others said it was a warning from God. To make matters worse, the Catholic Church was very powerful in Portugal. It controlled much of the country's wealth and power. The church took advantage of the disaster, blaming people for the disaster and using it to gain more power. This led to major changes in European philosophy. Some people became more religious, believing the disaster was God's way of punishing them. Others turned away from religion. They couldn't understand how a good God could allow such a terrible thing to happen. This led to a decline in religion throughout Europe, paving the way for modern science and technology. But let's get back to Lisbon. After the disaster, the King of Portugal asked a famous French military engineer named Jean de Gestis to rebuild the city. Justus divided the city into blocks and built wide, straight streets. He also designed new public buildings and parks. It took almost 200 years, but eventually the city was rebuilt. In 1995, a writer named José Saramago wrote a novel called Memorial do Convento. The story is set in Lisbon before the earthquake. It's a tale of magic and mystery. And if you want to learn more about life in Lisbon before the disaster, read this book. Let me tell you a little secret. The reason why I told you about this book is because I'm releasing a podcast this month, and this is the first episode. The podcast is a journey through history's greatest disasters, and you can listen to it anywhere. We'll travel to Pompeii, the Titanic, and beyond. Now let's talk about something that might surprise you. The Lisbon disaster wasn't the worst natural disaster in history. Yes, you heard that right. There have been much worse ones. For example, in 1556, a massive earthquake struck China. It had a magnitude of around 8 on the Richter scale. It's considered the deadliest earthquake in history, killing around 830,000 people. The Shanxi earthquake devastated villages and towns. It destroyed millions of homes and led to widespread famine. Then there's the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. A massive earthquake struck off the coast of Sumatra, Indonesia. It triggered a huge tsunami that hit 14 countries. More than 227,000 people were killed and countless others were injured or left homeless. It was the deadliest tsunami in recorded history. Finally, let's talk about Hurricane Katrina. It struck the Gulf Coast of the United States in 2005. It caused catastrophic damage to New Orleans and other parts of the region. Over 1,800 people lost their lives, and more than $125 billion worth of property was damaged. These are just a few examples of the many terrible natural disasters that have struck our planet, but they remind us of the incredible power of nature and the importance of being prepared. What about the Lisbon earthquake? How does it compare to these other disasters? Well, in terms of death toll, it's not the worst. Estimates vary, but it killed somewhere between 60,000 and 90,000 people. That's a terrible tragedy, but nowhere near the hundreds of thousands who died in China or Indonesia. However, the Lisbon earthquake was much more far-reaching. It changed the way we understand our planet, and it led to major changes in science and religion. It also inspired artists and writers around the world. Painters like Goya and writers like Voltaire used the disaster in their work. The Lisbon earthquake may not be the worst natural disaster in history, but it's definitely one of the most important. It taught us valuable lessons about the power of nature and the importance of science. It also showed us that even in the darkest of times, hope can prevail. The people of Lisbon rebuilt their city, and they did it in a way that made it even stronger and more beautiful than before. And that's a lesson we can all learn from. What's your favorite thing about Lisbon? Tell me in the comments. And if you want to help us reach our goal of 1 million subscribers, click the subscribe button right now. Thanks for watching. See you next time.